This is the story of a mother whose daughter looked her in the eyes and called her a witch, a monster too ugly and embarrassing to attend her own child's wedding. But what that daughter didn't know was that the very scars she found so repulsive were earned the night her mother walked through fire to save her life. I promise you, this story will shake you to your core and remind you never to forget the hands that raised you. So settle in, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what happens next. Grace was 62 years old, and every line on her face told a story of sacrifice. She lived in a small townhouse with creaky floors and windows that rattled when the wind blew too hard. The furniture was second-hand, the curtains were faded, but everything was spotlessly clean and filled with love. Grace had raised her daughter Melissa alone after her partner walked out when Melissa was barely 2 years old. From that moment, Grace became both mother and father, provider and protector. She worked 3 jobs to give Melissa the life she deserved. Before dawn, she stocked shelves at the 24-hour supermarket, lifting heavy boxes until her shoulders screamed in protest. By mid-morning, she was at the diner, serving tables with a smile even when her legs felt like they might give out. Evenings and weekends, she took in ironing and alterations from neighbors, her fingers moving mechanically over fabric until late into the night. Every penny Grace earned went to Melissa. Private tutoring so she wouldn't fall behind. New clothes for school, while Grace patched her own shoes with cardboard. Dance lessons and art classes that cost more than Grace's weekly grocery budget. When Melissa got into university, Grace borrowed against everything she had, working triple shifts to make sure her daughter could chase her dreams without the burden of debt. Grace's hands showed the price of that love. They were rough and cracked, with permanent grooves in the palms and fingers slightly bent from repetitive strain. Her face carried deep lines around her mouth and eyes, shadows of exhaustion that never quite faded. But the most distinctive mark was on her neck, just below her left ear. A raised, textured burn scar that most people were too polite to ask about. Grace touched it sometimes when she was lost in thought, remembering the night that changed everything. Melissa grew up and became everything Grace had dreamed. She was smart, ambitious, beautiful. She climbed the corporate ladder to become a marketing executive at a prestigious firm. She wore designer suits, drove a luxury sedan, and lived in an upscale apartment in the city's most fashionable district. Grace was so proud she could burst. Every time Melissa visited, Grace cooked all her favorite foods and listened to stories about her successful life, her heart swelling with joy. One brilliant autumn afternoon, Melissa arrived unexpectedly at Grace's door. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a tall, elegant woman with perfect posture and expensive clothes that screamed old money. "Mom, this is Vanessa," Melissa said, her voice bright with excitement. "My fiancé. We're getting married next spring." Grace's heart exploded with happiness. Her baby was getting married. She rushed forward, pulling both women into a tight embrace. "This is wonderful. I'm so happy for you both." Tears of joy filled her eyes. Vanessa stiffened slightly, but allowed the hug. Her perfume was overwhelming in the small space, sharp and expensive. Grace didn't notice. She was too thrilled. She immediately started preparing tea and brought out homemade cookies. Already planning what she'd wear to the wedding. Maybe she could afford a new dress from the consignment shop downtown. "It's going to be quite an event, Mom," Melissa said, sitting on the old sofa. "Vanessa's family is hosting it at their country estate. Very upscale." "How exciting," Grace beamed. "I can't wait to meet everyone." Vanessa set down her teacup with deliberate precision. Her eyes swept over the worn furniture, the faded curtains, Grace's simple dress and weathered hands. She exchanged a meaningful look with Melissa. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Melissa cleared her throat repeatedly, suddenly unable to meet her mother's eyes. The joy drained away, replaced by thick, uncomfortable tension. "Mom, we need to talk to you about something," Melissa began, her voice dropping. "About the wedding." "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need," Grace said, though her smile began to falter. Melissa fidgeted with her designer handbag. The words seemed stuck in her throat. Vanessa spoke instead, her tone sharp and cold. "What Melissa is trying to say is that this wedding has very particular aesthetic requirements." My family's reputation depends on maintaining certain standards. Grace looked between them, confused. I'm not sure I understand. Melissa finally looked up, and Grace saw something in her daughter's eyes she'd never seen before: shame. But it wasn't shame for herself. It was shame directed at Grace. "Mom, we've decided it's best if you don't attend the wedding." The words hung in the air like poison. Grace felt all the oxygen leave her lungs. The clock on the wall suddenly sounded deafening. "What? Not attend my own daughter's wedding? Why?" "Look at yourself, Mom," Melissa said, gesturing toward her. "Your hands, your clothes, that mark on your neck. You look like you've had a really hard life." "Vanessa's family and our friends. They're sophisticated people," Melissa continued, her voice rising with defensive justification. "They wouldn't understand. You'd be uncomfortable. And honestly, we'd be uncomfortable explaining you." Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes cold. "You look like a witch from some fairy tale, hunched over, worn out, marked. Having you there would completely destroy the atmosphere we're creating. You'd be a distraction, and not the good kind." The word witch struck Grace like a physical blow. Her own daughter had just called her a witch, too ugly, too damaged, too embarrassing for her perfect day. Grace sat completely still. This child, the baby she'd starved for, the girl she'd worked her fingers to the bone for, was telling her she was too hideous to be seen. But Grace didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, something cold and clear crystallized inside her, like ice forming over deep water. She looked at Melissa and saw a stranger in expensive clothes. The little girl who used to hold her hand and call her the best mommy in the world was gone. Grace stood slowly, her movements steady and controlled. She looked at both women without speaking. Then she gave a single, deliberate nod. "I understand," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. Melissa looked relieved. "Thank you for being reasonable, Mom. We'll make sure you get lots of photos." They gathered their things quickly and left, neither looking back. The door clicked shut, and Grace stood alone in the sudden silence. She walked to the bathroom mirror and studied her reflection. The weathered skin, the tired eyes, the rough hands. She touched the burn scar on her neck, and suddenly she was there again, flames crackling, smoke choking, a child screaming in terror. Melissa had been 7 years old. Their apartment building had caught fire in the middle of the night, an electrical fault that turned their home into an inferno. Grace had grabbed Melissa from her bed, but the hallway was engulfed in flames. The only escape was through the burning kitchen. Grace had wrapped Melissa in a wet blanket, covering her completely. She'd carried her daughter through the fire, shielding her with her own body. A piece of burning ceiling had fallen on Grace's neck and shoulder. The pain had been indescribable, the smell of her own burning flesh nauseating. But she hadn't dropped her child. She'd gotten Melissa out safely. This witch's mark her daughter was so ashamed of was the scar Grace had earned saving her life. One tear rolled down Grace's cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness, it was a tear of decision. Melissa wanted a perfect wedding, free from her embarrassing witch-like mother. She could have it. But she would soon learn that a mother's sacrifice came with a weight she'd never imagined. The next morning, Grace dressed in her best clothes and went to the bank. She met with Mrs. Patterson, the manager who'd known her for 15 years. "I need to make some changes," Grace said calmly. She closed the joint account she shared with Melissa, transferring all the funds to a new account in her name alone. She cancelled Melissa's authorized user status on her credit card, which Melissa had been using freely for years. And she terminated the automatic payments for Melissa's luxury apartment. Grace had been the guarantor and had been paying the rent all along. Mrs. Patterson raised her eyebrows but asked no questions. She could see the steel in Grace's eyes. Next, Grace visited her attorney. She changed her will completely, removing Melissa and leaving everything to the Women's Crisis Center and the Children's Burn Recovery Foundation. When Mr. Thornton asked why, Grace told him everything. She told him about being called a witch. She told him about the fire and how she'd gotten her scar. "This mark my daughter finds so repulsive," Grace said quietly, touching her neck, "is the scar I earned saving her life. And she's forgotten." Mr. Thornton's eyes filled with tears. "You're one of the strongest women I've ever met, Grace." The documents were signed. Grace left feeling lighter, though her heart was broken. The wedding day arrived. While Grace spent the afternoon volunteering at a community kitchen, Melissa stood at an altar, surrounded by crystal and flowers. It was magnificent, everything she'd wanted. She looked radiant in her designer gown, smiling brilliantly for photographers. She didn't think of Grace once. She had no idea her life was already falling apart. On their honeymoon in the Maldives, Melissa and Vanessa lived in paradise until their final night. At an expensive beachfront dinner, Melissa confidently handed over her credit card to pay the enormous bill. The server returned, apologetic. "I'm sorry, Mom, this card has been declined." Melissa's face flushed. "That's impossible. Run it again." "I've tried 4 times. The account has been closed." Other guests were staring. The manager was called. It was humiliating. Melissa had to promise payment later through her employer. The next morning, she called the bank. They told her the card had been cancelled by the primary account holder, Grace, over a week ago. Melissa's blood ran cold. Why would her mother do this? Then she remembered Grace's face during their last conversation. That unnatural calm, that wasn't understanding. That was something far more dangerous. When they returned home, an eviction notice was taped to Melissa's apartment door. The rent hadn't been paid. She had 15 days to pay in full or vacate. "What is this?" Vanessa demanded. Melissa couldn't speak. She'd never paid her own rent. Grace had been doing it. "The witch you were too embarrassed to invite." Vanessa's voice dripped with disgust. "She's been funding your entire lifestyle." Within a week, Vanessa filed for annulment. The marriage lasted 11 days. Without Grace's support, Melissa's life collapsed. She couldn't get loans. Her car was repossessed. Former friends refused to help once they learned how she'd treated her mother. She sold her designer clothes for pennies and moved into a cramped studio. She took a second job bartending just to survive. Her hands developed calluses. Her back ached constantly. She was always exhausted. She was living her mother's life. And finally, she understood. Months later, after a brutal shift, Melissa found herself standing outside Grace's townhouse. Through the window, she could see her mother reading peacefully. Grief crashed over her, not self-pity, but crushing shame. She'd called the woman who saved her life a witch. She remembered being 7, tracing that burn with tiny fingers. "Does it hurt, Mommy?" And Grace had smiled. "Not anymore, baby. It's just my superhero mark from saving you." When had she become so cruel? Melissa couldn't go to the door. Not yet. She didn't deserve forgiveness until she'd earned it. She quit her corporate job and found work at a non-profit helping at-risk youth. She lived simply, saved carefully, learned to cook cheap meals. She rebuilt her life, not the fake, glossy version, but something real. 10 months later, she returned to Grace's door. She wore plain clothes, her hair pulled back practically. She looked tired, older, humbled. Grace opened the door and barely recognized her. "Mom," Melissa said, her voice breaking, "I'm so deeply sorry. For everything. For calling you a witch when you're my guardian angel. This scar..." She touched Grace's neck gently. "This is a badge of honor. You earned this saving my life, and I threw that sacrifice back in your face." She held out an envelope. "This is just the first payment. I'm going to pay you back everything. Even if it takes my whole life." Grace didn't take the envelope. She opened her arms wide. "Come here, my baby," she whispered. Melissa collapsed into her mother's embrace, sobbing. Grace held her tightly, stroking her hair. "I'm so sorry, Mama." "I know, sweetheart, I know, and I forgive you. Welcome home." Years later, when Grace passed peacefully, Melissa learned the will had never been changed back. Everything went to charity. Melissa smiled through her tears. That's exactly what she would have wanted. Because she'd finally learned the greatest inheritance wasn't money. It was understanding that love requires sacrifice, and the scars we bear for others are the most beautiful marks we can carry. Dear viewers, this story teaches us never to forget the hands that raised us and the sacrifices made in love. The marks we see as flaws are often badges of honor earned protecting us. What do you think? Did Grace do the right thing? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. We love you.